Good evening. Glad to have you with us tonight. For any new faces, my name is Tim. I'm the pastor here at Bethany Church, Kittery Point. Tonight we're going to hear a story about hope and redemption and the power of change and God's role in that story. As you've likely heard already, our featured speaker is Casey Mancuso. She's our worship arts coordinator here at Bethany Church, Kittery Point. And if you haven't been around for a worship service on a Sunday morning, I encourage you to join us so you can hear her phenomenal music abilities. But tonight isn't so much about music as it is about a journey of change and transformation. So let me give you a brief rundown on what the night is going to look like. I'm going to open our time by briefly sharing a Christian perspective on the topic of change. And I am well aware that when a preacher says, "I'll briefly share," everyone in the room is skeptical. But that being said, I will make it brief. Just watch. I want to do that, and then Casey's going to share her story, and then we're going to give maybe like a 1-minute intermission, and then you got index cards. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask Casey, we're going to kind of do a Q&A. We'll have you write the questions, we'll collect the cards, and then I'll play interviewer, and she can share some more anecdotes and stories and insights from her journey. So at the end of that time, if you want to come and chat, she'll be here to ask questions or answer questions of yours and to talk with you a little bit. I want to just acknowledge as we start here that inevitably, when we gather in an event like this, there's going to be people who are all across the spiritual spectrum, the religious spectrum, questions about politics, questions about morality, questions about drugs, whatever they are. I want to just communicate to you clearly and strongly that we are so glad you're here. This is a place where we are asking big questions. And so we are glad that people would come and join us on a night like tonight to hear a powerful story and also to wrestle with big life questions. That's why we're here as a church. So let me begin my brief comments by just giving you two theological concepts I want to lay out for you. And I think this will give us some food for thought about how change in life works. Here's the first truth I want to share. Number one, people changing is inevitable. But fundamental to the Christian faith is that character transformation in people's lives is possible and necessary. Character transformation is possible and necessary within the Christian faith. Your response might be, well, everybody changes. That's inevitable. But what I'm talking about is actually the process of change. Because we can have external changes, what we might call behavior modification, where my external activities are different. But central to the Christian faith is that we want internal change to happen. Not just we want to do things differently, we want something inside us to become different. And this is central to the teachings of Jesus. When you read through the gospel accounts in the New Testament, you'll see that Jesus is concerned not only about what you do, but also who you are. He digs down to a deeper level when it comes to the topic of change. The other thing I said is not only possible to change, but it's necessary. Part of the Christian journey of walking with Jesus is that you change. It is an expectation that would happen. It might be summed up best like this: God loves you exactly as you are, but he loves you too much to let you stay where you are. So he's always bringing us in a process of transformation. It's about not just externally being different, but change at the soul level. This is a necessity in the Christian faith. And one of the things that's wonderful about it is that God doesn't say change and then follow it up by good luck. He says change, and then he promises to walk with us and strengthen us and empower us toward that change. So that's the first truth, that God, part of the journey of the Christian faith is that change is necessary and it is possible. Here's the second thing. We can all and will all change, but are we changing into the kind of person we were designed to be? So yes, change will come. Yes, we can change our external behavior. Yes, we can even change at the character level. But part of the Christian faith, the Christian story, is to ask, to what end? What's the outcome? What's the purpose of the change? Why are you changing? Who are you changing for? And what are you changing into? One of the humorous, at times, events that happens in my house is that my 5-year-old son likes to lock the bathroom door. Sometimes he locks it when no one's in the bathroom, and as you make your way toward the restroom, you find out that it's locked and you have to scramble to unlock it. Other times you'll be in the bathroom washing your hands and you'll hear a click from outside and he'll have locked you into the bathroom. So when that happens, what usually happens in my life is I go and grab a butter knife and I slide it into the slot of the outside of the door, and I turn it, and that works. It opens up the door. I disengage the lock. The butter knife works to accomplish the goal, but it wasn't built for that goal. A flathead screwdriver is built for that exact purpose, but the butter knife will suffice. And so let me just ask the question from the comical to more a cosmic level question. Do you want your life to be a case of it will suffice? Do you want your life to be something that will just do? Or is there something inside you that's calling to you for something bigger, something more grand? Do you want your life story to be something of beauty because you lived out of who you were designed to be? This is the ultimate question for us as humans. Why are we here, and how should I live? In the case with the screwdriver or the butter knife, we look and we say that there's a question about the design. What was it made for? And when you ask about the design, you inevitably lead back to asking about the designer. Within the Christian faith, we believe that there's purpose, and our designer has made us for a specific reason. That purpose is rooted in goodness and love, and it's to know the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, to experience Him and to share that love with others. And so it's not just a matter of will you change, but what will you change into, and does it fall in line with what you were designed to be? Character transformation is possible, and character transformation rooted in a deep purpose of knowing God, loving Him, and loving others is why we were made. And so with that said, I want to introduce you to my coworker, musician, talented individual, and most importantly to me, friend, Casey Mancuso.
Wow, that was quite the introduction. Thanks, Tim. Well, Tim already kind of introduced me and who I am. I'm honored to be able to stand here and share my story with all of you tonight. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Casey. I'm the worship and arts coordinator here at Bethany. And for those who do know me, it's really great to see you here. I'm grateful for your presence here. I'm going to be totally honest. I'm a bit nervous standing and speaking without a piano in front of me, or singing is not really my jam. So this is really my first time sharing my story in a crowd like this. I have shared my story once or twice before. Once was in front of a crowd of like 300 Indian kids in India on one of the trips that I went on. And so probably half of them couldn't understand me anyways. So that kind of took some of the pressure off. But the first time I told my true story from beginning to present was actually on a bus when I was in India with a group of people that I barely knew. And some of them are here tonight, and I'm extremely grateful for that. My story and where I've been can be really long and really complicated. So it's hard for me to know where to start. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents, Ben and Vicky, who some of you may know, raised me in church. They introduced me to my love for music at a very early age. I went to a Christian school. I had Christian friends. I went to Sunday school. My parents did the absolute best that they could to bring me up in Christian surroundings and provide me with the tools to equip me for my future. From what I've been told, I was a pretty happy child. I was always laughing. I always loved people. I know that's probably hard for you to imagine. But as a matter of fact, my parents had a 4-point harness that they would put on me when we were in crowded areas because my mom was afraid that I would walk off with a stranger because they were my new best friend. Some of you may know I have an older sister, Katie. Katie has a story of her own, but some of her decisions affected all of us in very different ways. She went down a very dark path at a very early age in life, and it caused a lot of disruption during my formative years. I have a few bad memories of that time in my life, and it ultimately left me with a lot of pain that I would discover years later. But if there's one thing that I know now, it's that God had the Mancuso family in his grasp, and he never let us go. And then Dominic came along. He was a bit of a surprise to all of us, especially my parents. When I look back now, I know that God strategically placed Dom in our lives as the glue. I'm not sure he really knows that, but we all do. I'm not sure that we would all be in the place that we are right now if it wasn't for him. At least I know that I wouldn't be. My parents, they may feel a little bit differently. But for those of you who know my family, you know that Dom and I, we're best friends and we're practically inseparable. And I'm extremely blessed to have that kid as my brother, even though he can be a knucklehead at times. Once I hit high school, that's where I really started to have some trouble. I had a very hard time standing on my own 2 feet. I struggled with standing up for what I believed in. I struggled with feeling out of place. I struggled with friendships. And I think that I experienced more loneliness than I even knew. I was surrounded by friends and I was surrounded by family, but for some reason, I always felt so alone. I struggled with the idea of having my own relationship with Jesus rather than just being, riding kind of on the coattails of my family. And you might say that this isn't different than what most kids deal with, but most kids don't grow up wondering if their older sibling is hurt or safe, or whether they're going to show up in the middle of the night or be worried every time the phone rings. I took on that worrying alongside of my parents because I didn't want them to feel alone. And the three of us, we kind of went through this together, all while raising my little brother. Even though there were lots of celebrations growing up, sports events, concerts, piano recitals, lots of really great memories, there was always something missing, and we all knew what it was. It was my older sister, and that really hurt. Church and Christianity, it had become a routine for me, and there was never an invested personal relationship with Jesus on my end. And as time went on, I learned that was a very slippery slope. All I wanted to do was fit in with the cool kids, or really whoever would accept me as a person. I remember seeing the Christian kids around me that were always making good decisions. They were getting good grades, and they seemed to just be living the perfect life, and that wasn't me. I was a nice kid. I made people laugh. Everyone loved me, but I couldn't make a right decision to save my life. I graduated high school, and I went on to Southeastern University in Florida. And when I look back on it now, I don't see that I had any direction. I was just doing what the natural next step was for me. Leaving my family was really hard. I felt like I was abandoning my mom and my dad, and especially my little brother. I floundered around there in Florida. I got horrible grades, and I even got into a little bit of trouble here and there. At the end of my first year, my parents thought that it was best for me to come home because the future just wasn't looking great for me based on my high-risk choice pattern. Once I came back, I jumped back into my church routine, and I even tried to go to school here, but that really didn't work either. I ended up landing my first full-time job for a cellular company that actually no longer exists, and that's where my life really began to take a different turn. The location that I worked out of was in Biddeford, but every so often they would send me up to Auburn, Maine, because that store needed some extra support. For those of you who don't know where Auburn, Maine is, don't worry about it. You don't want to go there. I thought I had finally found my calling, and it was sales. I was really good at it. And as a 19-year-old, I was making more money than I knew what to do with, and I was burning through it at even a faster rate. I found my place. I thought I had arrived, and it wasn't long before I met this guy. And now looking back on it, I believe that he had me targeted from day one. I remember the moment I met him, it was like yesterday. I remember having this really weird feeling the first time I saw him, and I can't really explain what it was, but it was just this weird feeling. And it wasn't long before he had me completely convinced that my parents were against me, that the church was keeping me sheltered from the real world, and he was the one that was going to teach me about life. So in rebellion to everything that I knew, everything that I had been taught, I left. I went out, I bought my own vehicle, I packed it up, and I left. I had so much pain built up from my early years. I had no relationship with Jesus, and I had no idea who Casey really was, and I was off to go find her. I moved in with Josh, and very quickly, this relationship turned toxic. He was manipulative, abusive in some ways, and everything that you would never want for your daughter. But for some reason, in my eyes, he was perfect. He was able to make me feel like that's where I belonged, and in this warped way, he made me feel loved. The opioid crisis, as we all know, is completely out of control right now, especially in Maine, and it wasn't long before it made an appearance in my life. I had dabbled a bit here and there and in college, but never to the level that I was about to embark on. Day by day, he was creating an environment for me where I was completely dependent on him and whatever pills of his choosing were, all while growing farther and farther away from my family and everything that I knew back in New Hampshire. At this point, I quit my job, and I was solely dependent on him, and I was living at home, and the relationship had grown so toxic and so out of control that he actually kicked me out and sent me back to New Hampshire. That was the first night I slept in my car. I was a complete mess. I couldn't go back home. I was so embarrassed, and I was so ashamed, and now I had developed this little addiction on the side. To me, opiates, popping pills, that was all normal. It had been embedded in me that was normalcy. That it was the cool thing to do, that it was the only way for me to escape all this hurt and pain that I had built up and had been carrying around with me for so long. Everyone I knew was involved in opiates in some way, shape, or form. Opiates were a way of life. Well, I moved back to New Hampshire, and I once again stumbled around everywhere. My opiate use got worse, and I was very good at keeping my habit hidden. I was so good at this point that my parents didn't even know. I started a job where I immediately discovered who all the pill people were. That's what us addicts used to do. You can recognize a fellow opiate addict in a room of 1,000 people, and then you become friends. And even though Josh had kicked me out and made it abundantly clear that I wasn't good enough for him, whatever that meant, he always kept me on this string. He never let me go. It was almost like we hadn't even broken up. After being separated for about 9 months, he showed up at my apartment, declared his love for me, said that leaving me was the worst decision he had ever made, and begged for me to take him back. He promised me that this time it would be different, and he wanted to create a life for us, that I was the best thing that ever happened to him, and that he needed me. This was my parents and everyone who was around me. It was their absolute worst nightmare. And yes, I took him back. I took him back because I didn't know what else to do. Josh knew me. He knew my addiction. He claimed to love me for me just as I was. And who else would do that? He wanted to give me a life and a future, and so I said yes. It wasn't long before he moved me back to Maine, and now I was right back where I started. I was living in the exact same place, this disgusting hole that he tried to pass off as a home for me. Josh, my friend Jeremy, and I, we all lived together. Some of you may have heard me talk about Jeremy here before, but if you don't know who he is, I'll get to him shortly. But shortly after moving me back to Maine, Josh decided that it would be in our best interest if he got his CDL license, that this was the only way to give me the life I deserved, and this actually caused him to be gone for about 4 to 5 weeks at a time, and then home for 3 to 4 days. So here I was, 22 years old, addicted to opiates, living in a double-wide trailer that was barely livable at the end of a one-way dirt road in the middle of nowhere, with a German Shepherd who was 3 times my size. But Josh had decided that he was going to get himself clean so that he could pass drug tests, but didn't feel that it was necessary for me to do the same. He actually supported my habit, and as a matter of fact, now that I look back on it, he made sure that I stayed right where I was. And now I recognize that it was just so that he could keep me dependent on him. Naturally, Josh proposed, and against everyone's better judgment, I married him. What else was I going to do? And besides, I had next to no relationship with my family at this point. His family had welcomed me in with open arms. Josh made me feel like that's where I belonged. I had no voice, no opinion, no identity, no nothing. I belonged to him at that time, and all I could think was, well, at least I belong somewhere. With Josh's absence, Jeremy and I became best friends. Jeremy was always troubled, but him and I were incredibly close, and I always just had a way of getting through to him. I actually felt closer to him than I did to my own husband, and anyone who knew Jeremy and I would say that we had a very unique and close relationship. No matter what, we always had each other's backs, and I knew I was safe with him. However, Jeremy was a heroin addict, and he was the first heroin addict that I ever knew. With the rise of opiate use, the prices went up. The prices of opiates on the streets at that time were $1 a milligram. So an 80 milligram oxy was $80. At one point, I was taking 4 of those a day. So that's $320 a day. That's obviously not financially stable. So as an addict, what's your next step? You start selling. You start selling to support your habit. And so that's what I did. That's what I was encouraged by my husband to start doing. The street value of opiates continued to rise, and people I knew were dropping everywhere. So what's the next step? Heroin. Heroin's cheap, and it's easily accessible. I remember like it was yesterday, I came home from work. My husband sat me down and said that we needed to change up my habit. Like a parent sitting down to confront their child and their behaviors. It wasn't, let's get you clean. It wasn't, let's get you into rehab. It was, no, we're going to switch you over to heroin because it's cheaper and we can make you more money. I distinctively remember Jeremy being so much against this, but Josh didn't care. All he could see at that time were dollar signs and me in his grasp. It was a business decision. It was a financial decision. And what a better way to keep me dependent on him. See, this is the pattern. This is how heroin addicts get where they are. Just like me, they start with pills, they start with something small, and it's not sustainable financially, so they switch to heroin. Although with heroin, there is a huge risk factor, hence why it's so cheap. You never know what's in it. You never know who's touched it. So every time you inject it, you are playing Russian roulette with your life. Maine is the 6th worst state in the nation for the rise of death by overdose. From 2012 to 2014, when I was at my worst, the state of Maine averaged 1 death a day by overdose. In 2016, there were 385 opioid-related deaths at a rate of 25 deaths per 100,000. That's nearly double the national rate of 13.3 deaths per 100,000. In 2018, Maine set a record of 418 deaths by overdose. That number included a girl I know, Shannon, a guy I used to work with, Luke, a guy I knew by the name of Brian, my friend's sisters, Catherine, a girl I knew, Sarah, a coworker, Kelly, and the most painful one of all, my best friend, Jeremy. In 2018, there were 70,237 deaths from opiate overdose across our nation. And my reason for throwing these numbers at you is just to show how much of a miracle it is that I made it out alive. Because last year, over 70,000 people didn't. And those 70,000 people, they belonged to a family. That was someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's wife, someone's husband, someone's mom, someone's dad, someone's sister, someone's brother, and someone's friend. So here I was, completely isolated from everyone around me. Jeremy, who I felt was my only protector, had landed back in jail. My husband was on the road, and I was addicted to heroin and selling on the side to support my habit. I had an abusive husband in every way imaginable, and lost doesn't even begin to describe where I was. When I look back on the nights that I was alone, which there were many, I remember asking myself, how did I get here? How did this happen? How did God let this happen? Where's my rescuer? Who's going to save me from this? Is this my life? Is this all there is? There were so many nights that I wanted to call my mom and my dad and ask them to come get me, but I couldn't face it. There is so much shame and so much guilt that comes along with addiction that it's unbearable. The stories could go on, but I can't keep you here all night, and I really want to get to the good part. I finally made my decision to get clean with no help from my husband, but I was going to do it no matter what it took. My mother-in-law at the time, she took me up to their camp in Eustis, and she sat by my side for 12 straight days while I withdrew from opiates. It was hands down the worst experience of my life. Painful doesn't even begin to describe it. Think of the worst flu you can imagine and multiply that by 100. Your limbs, they feel like they are going to tear off your body. You are sick, you're vomiting, you're sweating, you're cold, and all while going through this, all you need is the smallest dose of anything, and it goes away immediately. But Tammy, she wanted more from me than that. She held me while I cried. She held me while I screamed. She held me while I swore at her up and down. She held my hair while I was vomiting. She rubbed my legs and my shoulders to try and take my pain away. She sat with me in a tub full of cold water to try and bring my fever down. She talked to me about my parents and how I needed to make things right with them, even though it seemed impossible. She talked to me about how I needed to get out of Maine and away from her son. She talked to me about how I was the daughter that she had always wanted, and I was one of the best things to ever happen to their family, and especially to her. She was the perfect image of Jesus over those 12 days, and I don't even think that she knew it. On December 23rd, 2017, Tammy passed away from a long battle with breast cancer. I was able to sit with her in her last days, just like she sat with me, and her last words to me were, "Promise me that you'll be a good girl." I will never forget that moment, and I've done my absolute best to hold up to that promise. I was able to pray with her before she passed, and I'm confident that she's standing with Jesus, and there is no doubt in my mind that Jesus embraced her and held her and loved her the way that she embraced and loved me. After being clean for some time and finally getting some clarity, I mustered up the courage to leave my marriage. I was so scared. I was scared of how Josh would react. I was scared of being alone. I was scared of having nowhere to go. But I knew that the only way I was going to be okay was to leave that relationship for good. I finally had had enough. And on June 8th of 2013, I made the decision to leave. This took Josh by surprise, and it was the most violent and emotionally unstable I had ever seen him. I barricaded myself in the bathroom, and I waited for some friends to arrive to help me with the situation. One of my girlfriends, she packed up my belongings as fast as she could, while Jeremy kept Josh away. I left, and I never looked back. The first 72 hours of being gone were the absolute hardest. I wanted to go back so bad. Just like heroin, the first 72 hours are the absolute worst. But after that, you can start to see the light. I knew I had made one right decision, and I was not going back. My life was far from together at this point. I was still a mess, but luckily I was clean and in the beginning stages of getting away from this relationship. I spent the next few months trying to figure out what my next steps were going to be. Was I going to move home? I couldn't do that. Was I going to stay here in Maine? I didn't think that that was smart. I felt like I just didn't belong anywhere, and I was more lost than I think I had ever been. I was just kind of in limbo and once again having no direction, continuing to make extremely poor life choices. After a series of events that came crashing down on me from decisions that I had been making, I had a complete nervous breakdown. Everything over the past 4 years had culminated to this moment. I had never felt more alone. I had never felt more lost. I had never felt more of a failure, more hopeless, more worthless, more unloved, more isolated, and more ashamed. I had no idea who I was. I had no idea how I had gotten where I was, and ultimately, I decided to take my own life. How could anyone love me after this? How could God do anything with my life at this point? How could my parents love me? How could I have friends? How could I look at myself in the mirror? How could I come back from any of this? I remember thinking the literal thoughts, my family and everyone around me will just be better off if I'm gone. So August 23rd, 2013, I overdosed on medication that was carelessly subscribed to me by my doctor. And thank God for my friend Tia, because she called 911 when she realized something was wrong. The EMTs broke into the house. They found me on the floor with a needle beside me, and I was slowly fading. And that's where most of my memory of that night stops. But the only thing that I really do remember about being in the ambulance was an EMT holding the phone up to my ear, and I could hear my mom crying and begging for me to hold on. When I woke up, I was surrounded by nurses in the emergency room. I was told by a nurse that we were going for a walk, and we walked down this really cold and bare hallway where I was brought to the psychiatric unit. If there's anyone in this room that has ever taken that same walk, you know it's the absolute worst. I started to go into a panic. I became extremely agitated, where security had to come help and move me. I have never been more scared in my life. Everything had been taken away from me, including the hair elastic that was on my wrist. I was put in a room with white walls, with nothing but a bed, a pillow, a blanket, and a distinct smell of hand sanitizer. I remember the door shutting behind me, and the actual sound of that door closing, it still plays over and over in my head. So there I was, completely alone, in a padded white room where I couldn't do anything except sit still. Once I stopped crying and panicking, I was quiet, but the silence was deafening. I remember out of nowhere this sense of calmness and safety just pour over me. And that was the first time I remember hearing this soft yet familiar voice, and he so clearly said, "Are you done running?" Right then and there in that padded white room, I surrendered, but I really didn't know to what. All I knew was that I was done running, and I knew that I needed to go home. The morning after, the security guard told me that I had a visitor. It was my dad. I remember looking at my dad filled with so much shame and so much embarrassment because I was Casey, and this is the stuff that they went through with my older sister, not with me. He sat on the bed next to me. I said, "Hi, Dad." He said, "Hi, Case. So, are you done running yet?" And my head dropped, and I immediately began to sob. I had no idea what my next step was going to be, but later that afternoon, my mom and dad came back, and that was a bit harder of a discussion, but it was decided that I was going to be released into my parents' care. It's a really crappy feeling, having a doctor tell you that the only way you can leave is if you go with your parents at 27 years old. Not seeing my parents, and I don't even know how long, having to explain everything to them about where I had been, what I had done, it was not fun. But the worst was yet to come. I had to face my brother. That was so incredibly hard and painful because I had sworn I would never hurt and abandon him the way that my sister had done to me. I remember laying eyes on him in my parents' garage, and the first time he saw me, he grabbed me, he hugged me, and then he got really mad at me. He wanted to know why I didn't think of him when I tried to take my own life, and why I didn't think of what his life would be like without me in it, and how could I possibly think that his life would be better off without me. I broke down into a million pieces because I literally, at one point, I thought that his life was going to be better without me in it. And I didn't want to embarrass him. I didn't want to cause him any more pain. I couldn't have been more wrong. And it was that moment, sitting in the steps of my parents' garage, that I promised I would fight. I promised I would fight because of him, and I promised that I would change my life around, but I still didn't know how. That was Friday afternoon. I'm fairly certain I slept all through Friday night, all through Saturday, right into Sunday morning, where my dad very loudly opened my bedroom door and said, "Let's go, you're coming with us to church." At this point, my parents had been attending Bethany in Greenland for many years, and I really didn't want to go to church. I was not up for it, but he told me that my options were either going back to the hospital or getting up and going to church. So needless to say, I quickly chose option B. I remember pulling into the parking lot of our Greenland campus, and my heart started pounding. And these feelings of anxiety and shame and fear, it just all came rushing over me. And I remember thinking, this is going to be so awful. This is going to hurt. This is going to be embarrassing. I've let my parents down. I've let my brother down. I've let myself down. And I certainly let God down, if he's even still there. I wanted to be anywhere but there. And I think my brother knew how much I was dreading this because he very gently reached over, put his hand on top of mine, and he gave me this wink. I'll never forget that. I had done everything in my power over the past few years to avoid church, to avoid worship music, to avoid prayer, to avoid God. I just felt like I had blown it. We walked in through the doors. I kept my head down, and I stayed real close to my mom's side because that's what I do as an adult, even now at 32. And I went and I sat down. Within 60 seconds of being in that sanctuary, we were bombarded with people from the church. Some of them were hugging me, asking me how I was. They made it very clear that they had been praying for me and that they were so glad that I was there. Half these people I didn't even know, and a few of them I had met over the years. One of the first things I remember was a good friend of the family, Scott Harris, saying, "When are you going to start singing here? This girl has a great voice." I was like, I'm 48 hours out of the hospital, and we're talking about me singing? Yeah, I don't think so. I hadn't sang anywhere in an extremely long time, let alone in church. I had played around in Maine at some bars here and there, but it just didn't feel right. Anyways, I was shocked by how welcoming every single person was that we came in contact with, but to be honest, it felt good. There was this little sense of relief inside me that I hadn't felt in years, like, okay, this place didn't burn down, and so far people are incredibly loving, so we're 2 for 2. I remember that we were into the second worship song, and tears just started flowing down my face. I missed this. See, this is when I really learned that God knows us each by name. He knows our innermost beings. He knows exactly how to communicate with us so that we'll hear him. And that's worship music for me. And apparently a padded white room, but I prefer music. Thank you. And I think he does too. I remember hearing the words, "Come out of sadness from wherever you've been. Come broken-hearted, let the rescue begin. Come find your mercy, O sinner, come kneel. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your face. O wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart, and come as you are." See, this is why on Sunday mornings here, I'm so careful with choosing songs because you never know who's going to need to hear what. And I want to be able to provide that safe place of rescue for whoever needs it. That was me sitting in a pew, lost and broken and feeling so alone. And if that wasn't enough, apparently God wanted to make sure I got the hint that day. Pastor Bruce got up and he preached on Romans 8. So now there is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. And because you belong to him, the power of the life-giving Spirit has freed you from the power of sin that leads to death. I remember looking around my seat, specifically looking at my mom, and being like, what is going on right now? Like, was this planned? Well, duh, it totally was planned. God planned it, and he clearly wasn't wasting any time. See, for those of you sitting in this room wondering, okay, what's going on right now? That's not nothing. That's God. He's trying to get through. So just listen. And let me tell you the direction that he put me in after I finally listened. He led me back to my family where relationships were restored, where I have a relationship with my mom where she is my friend and the relationship is irreplaceable, where I have a relationship with my dad that is, well, it's us. He knows what that means. I have a great relationship with my brother, and now I get to walk alongside him and be part of his future. He led me to Jean and Linda Bullis, members here at Bethany, who gave me my wings back and brought me back to life. Linda has walked with me each step of the way and is still walking with me. She sat with me as I tore back layer by layer of where I had been, what I had endured, and what I was feeling. She has done nothing but show me the love of Jesus since I met with her that first time. She will be the first one to tell you that I was a hot mess when she met me. I think her exact words were, yeah, she was a bit unstable. I don't think she quite knew what she was getting herself into with me, but you guys have no idea the amount of hours that woman has invested in me, the amount of prayer, encouragement, and love that she has poured over me. She even took me to India with her twice after I said no twice. And when I told her how crazy it was that the church had asked me to start singing, she said, "That's right where you need to be. You're the crazy one for not wanting to do it." He led me to Tally Westerberg, who has also stood by me from day one as a sister in the Lord. Her family has welcomed me in as one of their own, and we have had countless, very long, sometimes painful conversations just sitting in the car of an empty parking lot. She's the friend that tells me how it is, even when I don't want to hear it. God led me to Eric Roberson, who has become my mentor and my dear friend in the music world here at Bethany. He led me to Chris and Sandy Beliveau, who walked alongside me while I overcame my struggle with addiction, and even let me sleep on their couch when I wasn't sure if I was strong enough not to relapse. He led me to Rod and Bread to Town, Bill Olson and his wife Mo, Christina and Taylor Smalley, and Tim and Jenny Carpenter, and tons of others that have come alongside me and have shown me nothing less than love and encouragement. They have provided me with a true sense of belonging and showed me who I am in Jesus. They have been a perfect example of what Bethany Church is all about. Be one, make one. And ultimately, the best part of all, he led me here to Kittery Point. After 2 overdoses, being raped, surviving an abusive marriage and a suicide attempt, I'm standing here in front of all of you to show you that there is hope in the darkness, that there is joy beyond the tears, and to show you that our God is a God of miracles. See, the thing is I wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for all those people who came alongside me. That's how I saw Jesus. That's true love. Not isolation, not addiction, not codependence, not tearing someone down, not fear. Those are all lies from the enemy. All those feelings of shame, fear, hopelessness, and loneliness, those were direct from the enemy to keep me from being one for the kingdom. And he wants nothing more than to seek and destroy us. But I can stand here and say that our God is a God of victory. And that's how I was freed from my addiction, freed from the chains of hurt that I had caused, chains from the relationships I thought I had once destroyed, freed from an abusive marriage, freed from all shame and all guilt. God didn't just open up the heavens and send light down and all of a sudden I was better. He used his people. He uses us. And that's why it's so important for us to love one another, to be kind and to be uplifting, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable. Just to be there when someone needs you, to just listen and embrace them like Jesus would. I wouldn't be standing here if it hadn't been for any of that. So if you remember Jeremy, I had mentioned him earlier. Jeremy had tried heroin for the first time when he was 15, and last year on April 18th, 3 days after I had seen him last, at 35 years old, he passed away. He fell to his sin, and I don't know how, I don't know why, but he picked up some heroin right outside of his house after Bible study and used the smallest amount, but unfortunately it was laced with fentanyl. And Jeremy lost his life along with 4 others that night within a 5-block radius. This is how lives are taken now. For those of you who don't know, fentanyl is actually 100 times more potent than heroin, and there's no way for you to know that it's present. The good news about this is that Jeremy came to know Jesus 2 years before he died. He got saved through the Salvation Army rehab facility in Portland and spent the last 2 years of his life being who God had called him to be. He led a handful of people to the Lord, and in that time he was a great dad, son, and really great friend. I was blessed to be a part of that. It's unfortunate that his sin took him from us, but I know without a shadow of a doubt that he is standing with Jesus. And we're all sinners. We all fall short. Ultimately, his sin cost him his life here on earth, but it granted him eternal life in heaven. So to answer tonight's question, does God really change lives? Yes, he absolutely does. I just happen to have taken the scenic route. No one is perfect. We will never be perfect, especially me. But luckily, our God doesn't call us to be perfect. He calls us to be obedient, and he calls us to love him. But he does change lives, and he does it through all of you, or I should say all of us. So if you're here tonight and you are lost, or you are hurting, or you are struggling with addiction, or shame, loneliness, isolation, whatever it may be, hear me, that you are welcome here. He wants to love you, so be loved. He wants you just as you are in all of your glorious mess. This is why he died for us, to wipe all of that away. Let us show you his love. Let us help you. Let us show you that God wants so much more for your life of abundance and of blessing. A life of lots of love and a life of lots of laughter. Not a life filled with isolation and lies. A life where you can experience all that he has planned for you. When you see me standing up here on Sundays and I have tears pouring down my face for no apparent reason, it's because he brought me through the fire. It was extremely painful, but he led me to a life free of addiction, free of pain, free of suffering, free of chains of shame and guilt, and freedom from feeling unworthy and worthless. I have worth in Jesus. I am clean in Jesus, and I am whole in Jesus. He changed my life, he changed Jeremy's life, and he can change yours. Embrace the love of Jesus in your life. Open your eyes, lift up your head, because he wants to welcome you into his kingdom with open arms. I know that it may not have been easy to hear everything that I have told you tonight, especially for my mom and dad. I know it's painful. But what's the point of my life if I don't share what God has brought me through, what he has brought my family through? I have survived a lot, and only by God's grace am where I am today, a worship and arts director at Bethany Church. I'm standing here 6 years clean of heroin because we serve and worship a loving God who has always been and will always be a God of victory and a God of miracles. Thank you.
I do want to ask you, before I come to these questions, can you just share a little bit with the group about what it was like when we struck up this conversation and said, hey, what do you think about this? And then what was the process of coming to like the yes, we'll do it, yes, we'll actually have this night, and
Oh, thanks.
there you go.
This night,
Thank you.
the conversation about tonight?
Yeah, like when we talked, this was months and months we've been talking about this, but when you finally said, okay, yes, I'll do it, what was that like to say, I'm going to share my story with everybody?
Well, first I wanted to know if you wanted like the sugar-coated story. Like life is hard, life was sad, and Jesus won. Amen. But it's not easy because to go back to a lot of this stuff, it hurts. But like I said in my thing, it's like, what's the point of surviving? What's the point of making it through everything that I made it through to just keep quiet? And I know there's at least one person in this room that needed to hear that. And so if that's all that came out of it, then it was totally worth it.
Mm-hmm. Good word. You can have a drink now.
Thanks. So good.
So one of the questions was, the person says, I don't recall you saying exactly what happened that made you decide that you wanted to get clean. Was there a particular thing that clicked one night you said, I just want to be clean?
Yeah. So the thing that, there's like a little hum if we can, sorry. Honestly, for anyone who's walked through addiction, especially myself, when I think of addiction, I think of the word slavery. Mm. And I was tired of being a slave to this monster. And I mean, it's exhausting. Quite honestly, being addicted to opiates, being addicted to heroin, it is exhausting. And it takes a lot out of you. And I was tired of being sick. I was tired of not being able to hold a job. I was just tired of it. So I think that's kind of what it was.
Yep. Can you talk a little bit about your time in the cell? I'm assuming that means the padded room. How did you feel in the moment when God, thank you, finally spoke?
So I can't. So that moment of being in that room, excuse my language, but it really sucked. And you want me over here? Oh, sorry. I felt really trapped. I felt really isolated. I was fearful about what was going to happen to me next because I was like, am I going to be one of those people that's in here for like 2 weeks? And but I don't know. Once I heard like those distinct words, it was like I knew it was God, but I didn't want to like accept that it was God. And so I was like, okay, even though I'm alone, I'm not alone. Like, I'm going to come out of this. And it was like everything that my parents had instilled in me growing up, like, came flushing back. Bible verses that I, had once studied, every Hillsong worship song from, like, back in the early 2000s was, like, came flooding back. So I think I just felt, like, the smallest sense of relief, but it was enough relief that it got me through.
Yeah. Well, what would you tell your younger self in order to, if you could kind of go back and speak to your younger self, what would you say to convince yourself to take a different path?
Honestly, this is going to sound really cheesy, but I wish I had listened to my mom more. My mom always told me that I needed to, I'm on the spot. She always said, you have to stand for something or you're going to fall for anything. And I wish that I had listened to those words better. I wish that I had invested more in my relationship with Jesus, rather than focusing on things of the world, because that really got me nowhere.
One of the questions, let me just read a comment that just said, Dear Casey, thank you so much for sharing your powerful story. I'm so grateful for who you are and all that God has done in your life, and I'm sure that expresses what a lot of people are feeling tonight. So how can you best support someone who's overcome or is in the process of overcoming? How do you support somebody who's getting sober, getting clean?
Well, I think there's kind of two parts to that. Look, supporting someone who's trying to get clean or someone who's walking through an addiction doesn't mean that you need to just let them walk all over you, because a lot of times that comes with people who are addicted to substances is they have no boundaries. And they think that just letting them walk all over you and giving them money and a place to stay all the time is like, that's not necessarily supporting them, that's letting them walk all over you. And you have to have boundaries. Like for me, I know one of my boundaries is I have to be careful with who I try and support. Like I really don't get involved with people who are currently using. Mm-hmm. If they are already trying to get clean or something, then I jump alongside them. But honestly, love them. Just love them and addiction blossoms in isolation. So when you are alone and you are just by yourself, that is when it gets worse. And so I think giving them a sense of community and giving them a place where they belong, unjudged and loved, is really kind of the way that you can do that. But by all means, you got to have boundaries.
Mm-hmm. How about on the other side of it? Somebody wants to know about what are signs you can look for so that you can be proactive and say, okay, I think this person may be wrestling with an addiction of some sort. What are ways they could pick up on that?
Well, I think it kind of depends on what their choice of substance is. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times with addiction, I mean, again, isolation. If they're constantly isolating themselves, fatigue, there's, when it comes to opiates, there's physical signs too. You might notice that they're itching themselves a lot, bruises, lots of trips to the bathroom, not being able to hold your head up, fading a bit. But as far as just like attitude, it's kind of signs. Mm-hmm. Again, isolation, not being able to hold a job down, almost like manipulating you a little bit, mm-hmm. Just mm-hmm. like never being able to say anything right. The person's just always mad, mm-hmm. angry, hurt, whatever, something like that.
What are some of those things that when you look like in where you are now, mm-hmm. what are moments that like strike you when you have these, like, wow, I'm in a different place now because back then I would have thought differently about this. I would have responded differently about this. Like, are there moments that you have throughout the week when something stands out to you and you go, wow, I'm new. This is a new me compared to X number of years ago?
Yeah. I don't use. I mean,
check.
I don't resort to, honestly, that's really, I don't resort to substance mm-hmm. abuse. I definitely don't resort to isolation. Like if I'm not okay, mm-hmm. well, I blow your phone up. True. Linda, Tally, my parents, like I make it clear, like I am not okay. I need help. My roommate, Katie, I'm very expressive about needing help.
The running joke at our some of our staff meetings is when an opinion is expressed that Casey doesn't necessarily agree with, she's working on it, but you immediately know what she thinks by her facial expression, and then immediately it turns to a big smile, so it's usually like this. And then she usually turns to me and goes, was that better? I said, that's better, but we still all know what's going on in your mind. Like right now, she's thinking that. So.
There was a meeting where he was like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm good. He's like, okay, then I need you to fake it better.
How about this question? Did you ever blame God when you were suffering, when you were struggling?
That's a really tough one. I think sometimes I blamed God for not intervening. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, so everything's saying I'm a child of God. Everything is saying that you're going to protect me, that you're going to love me, that you're going to, and like, it never happened, but it did happen. Now that I look back on it, like mm-hmm. how I am disease-free, how I'm safe, how I'm alive. He was there, so.
Can you go into a little bit more depth of like looking back on it now? What were moments when you were like, God was doing something here, God was doing, you talked about the people who surrounded you, but are there other key moments you're like, looking back now, I can see God was working there and there and there? Because I think some people could say, well, part of it is just like life. You just said, I'm tired of being addicted. I'm not going to be addicted anymore. I'm just going to make a different decision. But you're saying God involved in this.
Yeah. So, there was a night where I was home alone, and I had used, and something just didn't feel right. And I went and I climbed into my bathtub because that's what I was trained to do if something wasn't right. And I overdosed, and there is no possible way other than a complete miracle that I came out of that alive with no help from anybody other than God. Like everybody, not everybody I know, but the majority of people I know that has happened to, they have passed, and I didn't. So how else, what other possible reason is there other than that?
Yeah. How about some encouragement for somebody who's, they're wrestling? I mean, it sounds like one of the topics that really came out when you were sharing was the topic of shame.
Yeah.
Right? And so, one of the challenges that the church can face is that we feel, we've talked about this, everybody's welcome. And yet we want people to move from brokenness to wholeness, right? And so when someone feels like I can't come in, and then when I come in, people are going to tell me that I'm not doing things right, or something's not right in my life, and they feel like, well, I already know I'm struggling, and now I'm going to come into a place that's going to identify it even more. Like, what would you say to that person to say, no, keep coming, even though this is a place we're going to identify what the struggles are or the sin is, but we want you to move forward? Like, how would you encourage that person?
Well, I mean, sometimes you need to hear that. Sometimes you need to hear, like, what you're doing is not okay, or what you're doing is wrong, or what you're doing is putting you on a path that's going to lead you down this direction. And that's hard to swallow sometimes. You can get upset about that. You can get defensive about it. But, like, we're just coming to you in love. Like, we just want what's best for you. God just wants what's best for you. We want God's will for your life. And that's not a life of addiction. That's not a life of pain and isolation. And so I would say just, like, I don't know, just keep going, keep coming, because, like, you're going to experience God in miraculous ways. Like, once you surrender and once you, not that life is going to be perfect for you.
Sure.
But there's just this switch that happens in your heart. And does that answer your question?
That's good. That's good. How about, I mean, it sounds like, is it fair to say that some of those key people in your life who helped you in this process through recovery did both those things? They called things out in your life when you needed it.
Oh, yeah.
But also, you had a sense that this person's calling it out, but also they love me.
Yep.
They're not just saying, what's your problem? They're saying, this is a problem, but I'm going to be here to help you through that.
Yep. So, and a specific example of that is Linda and I have, I don't want to say gotten into it, but she has spoken to me in love firmly. And, I kind of cop a little bit of an attitude, like, okay, but then when she lays her hand on me and says, because I know that you're worth more, I know that you're stronger than this, I know that you're better than this, that's why I am bringing this forth, then, like, that's the example I would use.
Yeah.
When my parents, they tell me I'm doing something real stupid, but they love me anyways,
There are a couple here that they're all just cards I give to you then. They're just encouragements and thanks on a more personal level. So I we don't have a ton of questions. I think your testimony spoke very clearly and specifically about what you journeyed through. I want to give you a chance to share parting thoughts with people. I mean, you've invited people to come on the journey of meeting Jesus and finding freedom. But say anything that you want to say to close out, knowing that it's not just the ears here that are hearing, but there will be people who leave here and go somewhere else and share it with somebody else and say, hey, here's what I heard tonight. What are those parting words you'd want to share with somebody?
I don't have a paper in front of me. Parting words would just, my friend Tally, she sent me a song today called Be Loved. And somehow I've never heard this song before. And the whole song was just about opening yourself up to, like, the love of Jesus. And no matter how fast you're running or how far you've run, that he's, like, right there. And so I would say to you, be loved. Just be loved. And don't give up. And for those here that are struggling with some type of shame or addiction or guilt, like there is a light at the end of this tunnel, and this is not what God has planned for your life. Like I said, He wants you to have a life of laughter and of blessings. And the whole reason that I decided to speak was to show you that even through the darkness and through all of that, that He brings you out. Like the only reason that I'm standing here and that I am a worship and arts coordinator here is because of Him. And He had bigger plans that I had for myself. So trust in that.
Good word. Good word. I want to just a couple parting things before we close the night. First of all, Casey's going to be here if you want to chat with her after. She's happy to do that. Secondly is that if you're wrestling with something in particular, downstairs, when you head downstairs in the cafe, we've got a couple different brochures. There's a yellow one that says Caring Brochure, and there's a list of counselors and other resources in our area. It's not just come to our church, it's other people who are out there. So if you want to grab a hold of one of those, you can certainly do that. And then I just want to affirm what Casey said, is that this is a place where you are welcome. And so if you want to come on Sunday and you want to sit quietly in the back, and when everything gets done, you want to slip out quietly, you're welcome to do that. If you want to come and enter in and have discussions and be part of that, you're welcome to do that. But the doors are open. This is not a place where perfect people come on Sunday.
Right.
This is a place where broken people come because they know the one who's perfect. That's why we gather. So thank you for being here. Let's give one more round of applause to Casey. Well done.